before we get started, a little bit of a history lesson. You see, this isn't the first game developed by Falcom to carry the name of Xanadu. In 1985, they released the second game in their Dragon Slayer series, simply titled Xanadu, and ported it to a number of home computers, including various versions of the MSX and the NEC PC-88 series, and it was a wildly popular game at the time, selling over 400,000 copies, which was totally unheard of, considering RPGs were still not a very well established genre in Japan. In fact, it was Xanadu that clued other developers in on the potential to make some big bucks with this style of gameplay. So it's not a stretch to say that without the success of Xanadu, the history of RPGs could have been very different. There may never have been the inspiration needed to create series like Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, so us lovers of RPGs and JRPGs in particular owe Falcom a huge debt of gratitude for getting the ball rolling, and Xanadu has to be recognized as the game that started it all. Now we fast forward almost 10 years to 1994, and the PC Engine CD with Kaze no Densetsu Xanadu, which literally translates to The Legend of the Wind Xanadu, but in English it is simply called The Legend of Xanadu, and is technically the 7th game in the Dragon Slayer series, and one of the few games on the console that Falcom actually developed themselves, as they would usually license their PC games to other developers for their console ports, most notably Alpha System and Hudson Soft. Even though this game is tied to the Dragon Slayer series, they don't really have any connection to each other in terms of story, so you don't need to be familiar at all with the series to enjoy the story here. And speaking of, it's pretty light in Legend of Xanadu, but still gives you exactly what you need from a game like this. The setting is a fantasy world where most people have at least a basic command of magic, and your main playable character is an Imperial soldier named Arios, who, as it turns out, is the descendant of a great warrior who vanquished an all-powerful dragon some 1,000 years ago, and now it's his turn to follow in the footsteps of his heroic ancestor. This game is split into 12 episodic chapters that feature different towns, dungeons, objectives, and characters, and once you complete a chapter, you cannot revisit any of the locations included in it, so make sure you search every little nook and cranny for treasure before moving on. I already mentioned this earlier, but I'll reiterate that if you are a fan of the first handful of Ys games, then you should feel right at home with The Legend of Xanadu, because in terms of gameplay, the two are extremely similar. In particular, the combat. Xanadu uses the exact same bump attack method as Ys, so by simply walking into your enemies, you deal damage to them, and likewise, if they hit you in an unguarded spot, you take damage. Only in this game, you'll find that there are typically way more enemies on screen at any one given time than there are in Ys 1 and 2, for example. Also, something different here is that you can be accompanied by various support characters, and as they follow you around, they can also deal damage to enemies. So if you've got a couple of friends with you, you've got a nice little wall of death going. And by killing monsters and collecting the gems they leave behind, you can spend them on all kinds of weapons and items that you can find in that chapter's towns. Something that is kind of unusual in Xanadu is that at no point do you ever really gain experience points or level up, but instead, your maximum health increases over time as you repeatedly take damage, and each of your pieces of weapons and armor grows stronger individually as you use them in combat. So if you want to increase all of your stats in this game, you'll be wanting to strategically take some punishment as you're dishing it out. Something else of note in this game is that at the end of each chapter, the gameplay changes entirely, switching to a side-scrolling action platformer, which you might think is similar in gameplay to Ys 3, but oh no, this is definitely much better than that. I'd actually be happy if the entire game consisted only of this style of gameplay. The controls are very responsive, you have a variety of attacks at your disposal, and if you have a companion with you, they'll mirror all of your movements and help you out as best they can, or better yet, apparently, you can hook up a second controller for some co-op action, which I haven't had an opportunity to try yet, but it sounds awesome. These are also the segments where you'll face off with a boss monster to close out each chapter, and these encounters can get pretty intense. Also, the visuals in these side-scrolling segments are much nicer than their overhead counterparts, with big character sprites and a nice jump up in overall color and detail, while the overhead segments look pretty standard for a game of this type. Definitely not bad though, and if you like the classic anime stylings of PC Engine CD cutscenes, then this is the game for you, because it features around 2 hours of fully voiced cutscenes. Oddly enough though, despite being a CD game, all of the music in Legend of Xanadu is actually chip generated, so at least in that regard you can say the Ys games had something that this one doesn't, but the soundtrack here is still fantastic regardless. Overall, The Legend of Xanadu is a great action RPG that rivals the best on the console, and it's one I'd highly recommend playing to fans of the PC Engine who might have overlooked it. This is a game that has never gotten an English translation though, which is unfortunate, but even if it does take a little bit of trial and error, or maybe just a few semesters of Japanese, I still say this is a game that action RPG fans shouldn't miss. It's The Legend of Xanadu, and it's awesome.